quite attuned to what is happening in the U.S. They're convinced the U.S. will go to war with China. Hey, are we going to go into hyperinflation? I think, based on the politicians I see that we have, in my view, this is the lowest quality of politicians. Well, I just want to say one thing. People talk about the hawkish Fed and the hawkish ECB and central banks and so forth. We have to look at this matter in the perspective from a longer term point of view, because today we have a generation of people who grew up amidst artificially low interest rates that were distorting economic life. In other words, you had in Europe you had negative interest rates. Okay, negative interest rates is a kind of a absurdity that arose out of the so-called modern monetary theory and so forth, which is not modern at all, because it was already used. The example of negative interest rates in the 1920s. This year, negative interest rates. This is criminal in my opinion, because it led to a lot of inflationary symptoms like asset inflation. And in the US, we had next to zero interest rates since 2011 and massive money printing. And this then kept interest rates artificially low for far too long. And when inflation began to manifest itself, long before Ukraine, the central banker says, they all say, oh, it's the war where interest rates increasing and inflation is increasing. Began long before that. In any event, the adjustment recently is in terms of percentage increase huge. The 10-year Treasury note went from 0.57% in May 2020 to now over 4%. A huge increase, percentage-wise, in a short period of time. But when you talk about hawkish, you're saying interest rates on the Fed fund rate at 4% is hawkish when inflation is at 9%? You must be joking. Interest rates should be at 9.5%. Who steals money? The central banks have stolen money from honest people who had their money on deposit. Because if inflation is 9% and your deposit rate is, say, 4%, you still lose 5% per annum. Let's put it this way. In the 1930s and already before, we had the rise of the mafia, which was largely due to the prohibition time. So it created a black market and a second economy, a black economy or underground economy. The government won it, and then they adopted the methods of the mafia. So the idea of the mafia has taken over Washington, D.C., and politicians do nowadays, although they're democratically elected, they take measures that are dictatorial. And this was financed by central banks, period. I also want to add one thing. I started to work in 1970, so I experienced the tail end of the 1969-1970 bear market. I then experienced the 73-74 bear market, the 81-82 bear market, and the bear market, the crash in 87, and the bear market in Japan after 1989, and the Asian crisis, and the bear market 2000, 2001, and the great financial crisis 2007, 2008. In each these instances, stocks went down, but treasury bonds rallied. Now, this year, or starting a year ago, treasury bonds have gone down and stocks. In other words, if you had a mix of bond stocks in previous recessions, bear markets for stocks, bonds gave you some protections because they rallied. This time around, both went down. This is most unusual. The Fed denied the fact that this was a bubble, and they are still in denial. Powell also underestimated the severity of the inflationary pressures. But you see, the Federal Reserve and like the ECB are political institutions. They'll do what the voters tell them to do. Now, to be fair to Biden, he probably gave the approval to tighten, but he has to because the government's action. I'd like to make a statement. Inflation is always due to governments. 1800 to 1900 in the US, the federal government was very small, no inflation. We didn't have a central bank, no inflation. It came from massive fiscal deficits. The latest bout came from a huge federal deficit in the quest to fight COVID, which was man-induced, government-induced. It didn't come from a fish market and meat market in Wuhan. It came from laboratories, very clearly. And it was used as an excuse to spend a lot of money and to lock up people, to control people, and so forth and so on. But who is responsible for all this? You think any of these government clowns will ever go to prison? No, they get promoted. The worse you are in government in terms of your ability, the higher you will go. In my view, it has collapsed already. But you understand, statistics are made by offices. And if you look at politicians today, they all lie, all of them. And why should then the statistical office of the US be honest? They're all liars. And politically, they can show the economy is expanding. Yeah, look, if I send a check to each American, $1,000 present tomorrow, then they go and spend it, then GDP goes up. Is this honest growth? My government debt has gone up by $1,000 per capita. So you can do a lot of fiddling around with the economy. The reality is most people today, and we have statistics published by the Federal Reserve. People who are 35 years old, they earn less than their parents at 35 years of age, and they have less money than the parents had at 35 years of age. Statistics published by the Federal Reserve. Everybody can go and look it up. One of the Fed chairmen said, inflation is like a toothpaste. Once you let it out of the tube, it's very difficult to put it back in. And I think that we have today a system of a social system where governments want to be re-elected by offering comfort to the voters. In other words, you have a problem, I want to be re-elected, I say, okay, I will solve your problem. We have an inflation problem, I give you more money. So I send you a check for $1,000 because the gasoline price has gone up. You think it solves inflation? It perpetuates inflation. It increases inflation because I hand over money to you and I print it. And we have Social Security. And Social Security is adjusted to inflation, cost of living allowance adjustments, COLA. Now this year they go up a lot. Biden, of course, he claims it's because of me. Nonsense is built into the Social Security programs, this cost of living adjustments. But of course the adjustments are less than the real rate of inflation, but it goes up so people have more money to spend. So you understand, the system is so much entrenched into having to have some sort of inflation and having to print money, because now the pension funds are in deep shit. They all fell a lot. So they have huge unfunded pension fund liabilities. These unfunded liabilities are going to be very painful unless you can refill them with printed money. But I want to make clear, in the 70s, that's why I mentioned the movement of interest rates between 69 and 71, and then between 73, 74, and the low in 75, 76. When in the cycle of inflation, things move up over time, but they don't move in a straight line. They move up and down and up and down. The 70s commodity cycle was high grain inflation, 71 to 73. There were food shortages. But then wheat, corn, soybeans all peaked out in 73. They never made a new high in the 70s, okay? Then came cocoa and coffee. They had a bull market until 77, and then they collapsed and it was over. Precious metals, gold, silver, platinum, and also copper, accompanied by the energy bull market. The energy bull market started in 73, and then with interruptions, it went down a while after 73, but then it shot up again. It peaked out in 1980, the energy bull market. Precious metals bull market peaked out also in January 1980. I remember because they collapsed, it collapsed massively. We had lots of margin calls. Anyway, and so to say, are we going to go into hyperinflation? I think, based on the politicians I see that we have, in my view, this is the lowest quality of politicians